Erev Tov and welcome everyone. The question for tonight is, what is an Eruv? I'm actually going to give you the super duper short, simple answer. So an Eruv is either a naturally occurring or man-made boundary that surrounds either a neighborhood or a city that allows Jews who are observing the laws of Shabbat to carry items, push strollers, etc., things that are not immediately a part of their body, like their clothes, their jewelry, etc. That's the basic, simple answer of what an Eruv is. But the question is, what's the significance of it? How did we get there? How does one build an Eruv? All the ins and outs. We'll explore some of them in this class. It's much too big a topic to be done in just one evening. In fact, in the compilations of Jewish law, the section on the laws of Eruv it's one of the biggest sections. It's incredibly complicated, and I might kind of get to why it's so complicated. But maybe you'll pick up on it. And when I talk a little bit about the Eruv, which by the word Eruv means mixed, and you'll understand why that's significant later. When I talk a little bit about the Eruv that was built here in our neighborhood in Milwaukee, you'll get a sense of why it is so complicated. So why don't we go ahead and jump right into it. And before we get into Eruv, we need to understand a little bit about Shabbat, or the Jewish Sabbath, and specifically a word in Hebrew, melacha, which is usually translated as work. So I didn't bring the Hebrew here just because it's like a PowerPoint presentation, but you can look up the source later if you like. But actually, Elizabeth, if I could ask you to unmute, and if you would read, this is from the book of Shemot, Exodus, and it is one of the many times the Torah describes what is Shabbat and why we do it and what we're not supposed to do in it. So please, Elizabeth, from Shemot chapter 20, verses 9 and 10.
You shall work during the 6 weekdays and do all your melacha, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do anything that constitutes melacha. This includes you, your son, your daughter, your slave, your maid, your animal, and the foreigner in your gates.
Excellent. So there's a lot of information, helpful information here. One is that we don't do this thing called melacha. I didn't translate it here, but let's just say work. I'll translate it as work for the moment. Don't do any work on Shabbat, because the seventh day, which is when Shabbat falls out on the week, the seventh day is a Shabbat for God, and therefore it's Shabbat, it's a day of rest for you. And the word Shabbat is connected to the word shvut, to cease. So just like God ceased from actively creating the world or creating new stuff, so too you should cease from certain kinds of activities, and not just you, the Israelites, the Hebrew, the Jew, but everyone in your household, even people who are not Jewish. Now, does that mean non-Jews can't work on Shabbat? Of course they can, but they can't work on our behalf. So as an example, I can't cook on Shabbat. I can't cook food as part of the laws of Shabbat, so I can't ask a non-Jew to cook for me. But that's outside of the scope of this class. But the basic thing here is don't work on Shabbat because God doesn't work on Shabbat. But the question is, what does it mean by work? Does that mean I can't do my job? Is that the simple definition? The Torah doesn't tell us exactly what melacha, work, is. There are a few examples in the Torah of things that are not permitted on Shabbat, the Sabbath. Gathering sticks. There's a famous story of a man who gathers up sticks, whether it's to make a fire, to build a house, unclear. And the Israelites know that that is forbidden, and he's, given the death penalty for it. Making fire, another thing which is not permitted. But again, the Torah never gives a clear definition of it, nor an exhaustive list of it. So how did we get from the Torah basically just saying don't work to the complicated laws we have today? For example, it's not permitted to make toast on Shabbat, but which seems like the easiest thing in the world, but that's completely forbidden for those who are observant of the laws of Shabbat. But I could go into synagogue and spend 3 hours setting up chairs, setting tables, putting out food, cutting up vegetables, working myself to the bone, and that would be permitted. So how is that not considered work? And the answer to that comes, I didn't bring the actual source, but later in the Torah, in the book of Shemot, Exodus in chapter 30, the 30 or 31, it says, don't work on Shabbat. And then almost immediately it says, and here's how you build. This picture is the Mishkan, translated often as the tabernacle, but it was the portable sanctuary, place of worship for the Israelites in the wilderness. And the way our tradition and the rabbis understand that is when the Torah says, don't work on the Sabbath, here's how you build the Mishkan, is that's not accidental. Those two things are connected. How are they connected? Any work that goes into building and operating the Mishkan is the kind of work that you cannot do on the Sabbath. So look at this picture here. You have all of these ropes that are clearly hammered and nailed into the ground, and cloths that are sewn together, and fire and cooking of incense. There you go. You already have a couple of clear examples. You can't make fire, you can't burn incense, you can't sew, you can't hammer and build. And what the rabbis do is they come up with a list of 39 categories. They go through all the laws of building this Mishkan, and they figure out 39 distinct categories that are both building it and the activities that go there. Animal sacrifices. You do that for the Mishkan, so you can't do that regularly on a Shabbat. You can't hunt the animals, trap the animals, kill the animals, skin the animals, etc., etc. So anything related to the Mishkan is not permitted on Shabbat. However, if it's not related to the Mishkan, like setting up plates on the table is not specific to the Mishkan, you can do that. Setting up chairs is not related. So it's not about effort. It's not about hard work. It's about thoughtful, creative work that's specifically connected to the building and functioning of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So actually I want to pause there, because before we even get to Eruv, that idea is huge, both to Eruv, but to all of Shabbat, that all of the laws of Shabbat are connected to the building and maintaining and functioning of the tabernacle. So I'll pause, throw up any hands if you have any questions about that idea to clarify it. I'll pause, see if there are any questions. Excellent. There's also a chat feature. So if I don't see someone's hand, or if you want to ask me a question separately, go ahead, send me a chat. And if I can, I will get to it. So the next question is, great. We have all these categories: sewing, hammering, building, even writing is when they would take the Mishkan apart, because it was portable. And, like Legos, you have a manual to tell you which parts fit together. If they have 10 pieces of wood that look identical, how do you know which pieces of wood are supposed to fit together? You mark them, you write on them. Therefore, writing is forbidden. And again, every one of these 39 categories, in fact, so this is a kid's book that's actually, if you can find a copy of this, it is one of the best books, because it goes through all of the categories, and then it gives you examples of things that are relevant. For example, the incense that was burnt in the temple, or not the incense, the curtains in the Mishkan, were colored. Well, how do you make dye? You take it by, taking certain plants and grinding them. Well, how do you get those plants? You have to grow them. So it goes all gardening and everything like that, planting seeds, every single step in the process. And by the way, you think more globally, it's not even just the Mishkan. All of the fundamental building blocks of civilization are kind of included when you get into these 39 categories. And this is a cute way that someone did a chart of the categories here, whether it's gathering things up together, which a lot of these are agricultural, and they go from the most basic of planting wheat, collecting wheat, processing wheat, to making bread, etc., dyeing, tying knots. Again, it really covers everything that human beings do to create civilization. So those are the melachot, but the question is, in all of these categories of making stuff and building and cooking, where does carrying come in? The Eruv is meant to allow Jews to carry. The rabbis explicitly say that the laws of carrying kind of don't fit. They are included here in the 39 categories. It's called hotza'ah, which we'll read more about, literally taking out, but it doesn't seem to fit in here. You're not creating anything new. How's me picking up something, a bowl, and moving it from my house to the street? How is that creative work? How is that involved in the building of the Mishkan? So the answer for that is actually found in the Talmud, again, compiled in the 5th to 6th common century, or the common era. And Lynn, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you will please take the source. And again, I didn't bring here the original Aramaic text, but if you can see, some of it is bolded. The bolded is a direct translation, and the unbolded is explanation. But you could just go through it. And it's from the section on Shabbat, page 49b, the second side. So Lynn, please, with regard.
With regard to the matter itself, it was taught in a Braita in accordance with the opinion of the one who said that the 39 labors of Shabbat correspond to the labors performed in the tabernacle. As it was taught in a Braita, One is only liable for performing a label to which there was a corresponding labor in the tabernacle.
Pause there for a second, Lynn. The reason I just want to pause is that was basically a summation of what I just explained, that everything for Shabbat is connected to it. And actually someone just texted me, isn't Shabbat about creating something new or changing things? That's true of many of the labors, but that's not the definition of them. The fundamental definition is what's given here in the Talmud, is they're all connected to the Mishkan. And the reason that definition doesn't work for everything is because carrying, which is not creating something new, it's not changing the reality of something, it's not turning uncooked food into cooked food. So it really has to do with exactly what you just read, Lynn, which is it has to be connected to something they did in the tabernacle, the Mishkan. So where does carrying come in? Please continue, Lynn.
They sowed in order to grow dyes for the tabernacle, and therefore you may not sow on Shabbat. They reaped, and therefore you may not reap on Shabbat. They lifted the boards from the ground in the wilderness, which is a public domain, and placed them into the wagon, which is a private domain. Oh, that's interesting. And therefore you shall not carry objects in from the public domain to the private domain on Shabbat. They lowered the boards from the wagon to the ground, and therefore you shall not carry objects out from the private domain to the public domain on Shabbat. They took boards and other objects out and passed them from wagon to wagon, i.e., from one private domain to another private domain, and therefore you shall not take objects out from one private domain to another private domain on Shabbat.
Excellent, thank you. So that phrase, private domain, or in Hebrew, reshut, which is like your permitted area, we'll come back to what does it mean by public domain, private domain. It's very important to understanding the function of an Eruv, but the basic idea, and I think I brought an image here, is one of the things that the Mishkan was meant to do is to be portable. So you have to be able to take it apart, but you don't take it into hundreds of pieces and everybody grabs a board on your back. You take it apart and you load it up into the wagons. So one of the things that they would do is you would have your camp. You'd have your camp with the Mishkan in the center and everyone's tents around it. And then when it was time to move, you would pack up all the tents, all the Mishkan, and you would move to a new place. So moving things from one encampment to another location was a fundamental function of the Mishkan, is moving from your community to another place altogether. So that's the general idea, is transferring from one private area, again, like your city. They set up a village. It is less of a city. If we're moving it from your village to somewhere else, that's part of the Mishkan. So on Shabbat, the basic idea there is moving from your private village, from your private home, your private space, outside of it is not permitted. Now they get very specific in the source we just said. Literally, you load it up on a wagon, and each wagon is like a little house. Each wagon is a private little, enclosed area, and moving it from one wagon to the other, which is something they would practically do, even that is not permitted. And unloading it from the wagon, which again is something they would do on a weekday, it's permitted. That's not permitted on Shabbat, because all of these things are related to the functioning of the Mishkan. Loading it up in the wagon, moving it to other wagons, unloading it from the wagon. These are all essential parts of the process of moving, unloading, rebuilding, unbuilding the Mishkan. So therefore, those things are mirrored in the laws of Shabbat. Any area that is defined as a private enclosed space, the easiest thing is a house. We'll actually look at an image of that. You can't move something from inside of your house out to the public area. That's it. Just like you can't move from a wagon to a new area, you can't move from your house to a new area. And I think, is it in the next? So actually, you know what I'll do is I'll ask for any questions and then we'll go back into that idea about what does it mean to have a private house, a public space. So any questions just on how they got the idea of carrying from transporting the Mishkan? Any questions on that? Beautiful. Rifki, yeah. Just got to unmute yourself. I'll let you know when, yeah, go for it, please.
So do I understand it right? In your house, but if you go out your front door, you can't take it into your yard. That's not a part of...
That is an excellent question. So the basic concept you're getting very well is that because what the rabbis are saying is once it's on the wagon, it's fine. So anything that's already in a private area, like in your home or inside the wagon, you can move around fully within that. So you can carry things within your house. But if you move from your private property is maybe for this explanation, it's easier to say property. If you leave your property to go to public property, yes, one cannot carry in between those things. Either taking something from public property into your private property or vice versa. So
Not even to your front yard? Is that
the
not?
question is, it depends on how your front yard is set up. If your front yard is enclosed, there's a fence around it or an Eruv, and we'll talk about how you could do that,
Okay.
then it's considered an extension of your private property. But if it is open on all sides, there is no physical boundary whatsoever, whether a fence or wire, whatever it is, then it's not considered
Ah,
an extension of your private property, and no, one would not be permitted. So for example, my house, I have a semi-enclosed porch. So I can go out onto my porch on Shabbat with a book, sit there and read. But if I go right beyond my porch to the steps going out to the, opening in front of my house, no go. That would be considered forbidden carrying on Shabbat. So Rifki, that is an excellent question.
thank you.
It'll be very relevant later. So moving on, before we get on to a little bit more of the ins and outs of it, one of the questions that may or may not have popped up in your head is, so the Torah did not explain work, or it didn't say, what did it mean by work? So this idea of carrying, is it really mentioned anywhere in the Torah? Now, the rabbis often, once they have a law, they know that carrying is forbidden. They'll look for verses in the Torah that might hint to it. There's even a phrase for it, asmachta, which means to place something, like hanging your hat on something, like, oh, this verse might kind of be talking about what we're talking about here. Not really, but it sounds like it. So there are two verses the rabbis talk about in the Torah, going out of one's place. But the reality is there is actually a source in the Torah, in the book of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, who saw the destruction of the first temple. And one of the things that he was tasked to do by God as a prophet is to explain to the people why their kingdom, the southern kingdom of Judah, was going to get destroyed if they didn't change their ways. And it was a mixture of two main things. One is moral failings, not supporting the poor, not caring for others, being selfish, but also ritual failings. And in this description here, he talks about one of the things that people were doing. You're like, ooh, that sounds a lot like forbidden caring. So let's see, Jane, if I could unmute you, if you would read this source from the book of Jeremiah. So again, if you're saying, is there anything in the Torah that kind of is relevant to this forbidden caring, this is it from the book of prophets of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, please.
Thus said the Lord, guard yourselves for your own sake against carrying burdens on the Sabbath day and bringing them through the gates of Jerusalem. Nor shall you carry out burdens from your houses on the Sabbath day or do any work, but you shall hallow the Sabbath day as I commanded your fathers. But they would not listen or turn their ear. They stiffened their necks and would not pay heed or accept discipline. If you obey me, declares the Lord, and do not bring in burdens through the gates of the city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day and do no work on it, then through the gates of this city shall enter kings who sit upon the throne of David with their officers.
Excellent. So that last line is really nice, is if you keep Shabbat properly, the way God wishes you would, then the kingdom of Israel will continue, and the king, Israel will have kings, and everyone will, be happily ever after. But what's interesting here is when he talks about carrying these burdens into the gates of the city, which sounds like carrying, the context here is, and Jane, I wonder if you can get a sense, what kinds of things do you think people are carrying into the public spaces of the city, into the market spaces? What kind of stuff do you think they're carrying?
I don't know.
What would they're carrying stuff into the public markets. What am I going to show up with market? What am I going to throw over have a sack on my back full of what for the market? It's stuff too?
Food.
Merchandise. Excellent. Thank you, Ken. It's stuff to sell.
Mhm.
It's not about the carrying per se in this context. It's about don't do business on this day. But
So
the
what
way
you're
he
tempted to
describes
do
it, the
by
language is,
carrying?
what's that?
What you're tempted to do by carrying?
Well, so that's the interesting thing here is that if somebody says, Rabbi, I just want to put my key in my pocket so when I go home, I can unlock my door. Why is that such a bad thing? Fine, Rabbi, if you're going to say I shouldn't be going to the market and bringing my wallet because I'm going to go to the mall afterwards and shop, that ruins the Shabbat spirit. But I want to carry a siddur to shul so I can pray. Why is that carrying forbidden? Now, the answer to that is a little bit complicated, but the simple one is that rabbis, or Jewish law in general, often doesn't make distinctions between the why of the act. There are examples where it does, where the same action might be permitted depending on why you're doing it, like eating on a fast day. If I'm eating on a fast day because I love pizza, that's not permitted. If I'm eating on a fast day because I'm sick and I'm protecting my health, then it's permitted. So to here, Yirmiyahu is implying that the carrying is because I basically am not treating Shabbat like Shabbat. I'm making about my business, about my own selfish needs. I'm ruining Shabbat, and that's what the carrying is. Whereas today, even if the carrying's not for that, all carrying is forbidden. But again, at the end of the day, regardless of why one carries in the public, whether it's to go to market or just bring a key or a prayer book to shul, it's all forbidden. We'll talk about some exceptions at the end, but in general, anything that's not immediately part of my person, my clothing, my jewelry, watch, etc., no go. So, and this is a picture here of what Shabbat would have looked like if carrying was permitted. And this might have been what Yirmiyahu was seeing on Shabbat, is everybody just going to the market. Where's Shabbos? Shabbos doesn't exist if you're going to focus on your own needs instead of God's desire, the chefetz of Hashem, the desires of God. So there's the next part here, and I may actually skip this source because it might make it a little bit too complicated, but Maimonides, Rambam, in his work, the Mishnah Torah, basically says that there's 4 different types of areas. And the issue is carrying between these different areas. But I think it's easier when we talk about carrying to look at a picture of it. So these are the 4 different areas. I know they're written in Hebrew, but if people can see my cursor, there's Reshut Harabim. This is the public domain. This is like Times Square, a highway, just like a main public part of town. That's one extreme. The other is a Reshut Hayachid, which is in the bottom, the kind of the left here is like someone's private home. So within my home, I can carry all I want. Within the public area, technically speaking, I can carry stuff back and forth. The issue really is carrying between the public and the private, but the rabbi said, just don't even carry anywhere. Don't carry in the public. Then there's 2 other areas. One is called, in this bottom, it looks like a well, a makom patur. Forget about that. So complicated. It's not going to be relevant to an Eruv, but technically speaking, it's like a large fire hydrant or something like that. That's so big, it's sort of separate from an area. You could say, I don't even want to get into it because it's complicating me just even talking about it. But the third area is called a Carmelite, and a Carmelite is an area which it's not public, it's not Times Square, but it's not private property. It's something in between. It might be an abandoned field, or just like a quiet neighborhood park, or not even a park, just like some area where, again, it's not a million people going through, but it's not a private enclosed area. And that's really important because I am always allowed to carry inside of my home, 3 walls. And in fact, this other picture above it is a house. This goes to Rifki's question. This other picture above it has a house, 3 walls, and then that black strip is their front yard. And what do? They set up 4 poles and wires. They built an Eruv. We'll come back to how that works, but they basically extended their house to include the front yard. So I can carry freely in my yard, in my house, and I can set up an Eruv in this Carmelite. If I want to set up an Eruv and build walls around it, that's totally fine. But in a Reshut Harabim, 100% totally public space like Times Square with 1 million people going through a second, I can never build an Eruv. I can never, ever carry in a totally public domain. And the reason that's interesting, a little beyond the scope of our class, is there are places in Manhattan where there are Eruvs that many Jews will carry in, but some rabbis say, no, it's so public, it's such a giant public space, you can never, ever make it private property. I don't care how many wires or walls or fences you put up, this is always public property. You can never turn it to public property, you can never carry there. So Reshut Harabim, there's nothing we can do with. But the question is, can I extend my house, the private property of my house, to a Carmelite? If I live on the east side of Milwaukee in this lovely suburban neighborhood where there's not 1 billion people coming through a second, so it's more like a Carmelite, can I extend my private property of my house to this Carmelite? And the simple answer is yes. But how do we do that? How do you build an Eruv? And as I said, the word Eruv means to mix. And the point of an Eruv is to mix my private property with the property around my house, mixing it all up until it's like one big, giant, private, enclosed space. So this is a great picture of how you do that. Here are 4 totally private houses. You can carry inside of them. Each of those houses has a little courtyard, a chatzer, which is a courtyard in Hebrew, and there's walls around it. So again, to Rifki's question, I can carry from the door of my little house out into my shared yard. I can go to my neighbor's house right next to me because our yard is semi-enclosed. Just because there's a little opening, that's fine. It's fine if there's a little opening like a doorway, as long as it's mostly enclosed. But the question is, there's a big alleyway in the middle. That's not private property, but it's not totally public property. It's a sort of enclosed alleyway. So what can I do to be able to carry from our courtyard to the courtyard across? And what I have to do is basically turn it into a house. And how do you define a house? A house has walls and doors. Well, look at this. We already have these walls. So all we need now is doors. But you don't actually have to build a full door. All you have to build, in Hebrew, they call it a tzurat ha-pesach, the form of an opening. You do the shape of a door. And what's the shape of a door? 2 sides, 2 lintels, and a post across the top. So what do they do in this alleyway? And they've done this. You can go to Israel and communities all over the world. You'll see it. I did it in my house here in Milwaukee. I built one of these to be able to carry from our house into our backyard. You put up 2 lintels, 2 boards, and they can be made of a million different things as long as they're sturdy. Plastic poles, pieces of wood. I used wood that I got from Home Depot, and then you put something across the top. And it can be a string, a piece of wood. As long as it has the shape of a doorway, you made a house. That's it. All you need is walls and the shapes of doorways. And strictly speaking, as we'll get to in a moment, you could potentially just make doorway after doorway. You could just make a million shapes of doorways and just call that a house. We'll come back to what that would actually look like in a moment. But before we get into, so how do you do this in a huge city? This is great for a little alleyway. What do you do in an actual city or a big neighborhood? So before we get into that, questions up until now. And I see one in someone asked a question. The difference between melacha, which we said is a kind of work, and avodah, which also often translates as work. Avodah is more like serving, whether it's serving God or serving another person, where you're like a servant. You do often, Tamar just unmuted, maybe Tamar can say more about that, but melacha is usually more like a creative craft kind of work. Yeah, Tamar, please.
In the dictionary, you will find that avodah and melacha are synonyms. It's only in rabbinic literature that avodah is worship.
Excellent. So I think that, so that's important then. So in the rabbinic understanding, as I said, avodah is more like serving someone else. It's doing a kind of work, but it's work in service of either God or a master or a boss or something like that, which has the basic connotation of work, whereas melacha is a specific kind of a work, like a crafty type, thoughtful, again, like the basis of civilization. So for example, even though you do have animals that can carry sticks and build nests, in general, it's really only humans that are carrying things to build massive structures and temples like that. Susan, I see somewhere you're in here, but your hand is up. If I can find you, and then we'll move on. Where did you go, Susan? Yeah. Oh, excellent. Susan, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Well, the religious service has a prayer, the avodah.
Yeah.
Eved means a servant. So the service, I'm thinking like the morning services is, they use the word avodah for that.
Exactly. And again, it's a kind of work, but it's permitted work. So if you translate it as work and work, you say, well, how are you allowed to do work, prayer on Shabbat? Again, it's not melacha. Melacha is this is a better thing. Both of them might mean work, but melacha is a specific kind of work, which is related to the Mishkan, which is the tabernacle, which is not permitted on Shabbat, whereas avodah is a kind of work which is permitted because it's in service of God. So excellent. Thank you for that, Susan. So moving on now. So this is actually a general map. Some of the borders have changed slightly of the Eruv. I always say it looks like a kind of backwards California. And it's actually not the biggest. I thought it was the biggest Eruv in Wisconsin. I think it's not, but it's pretty big. And it follows the general contours of Lake Michigan on the east, the Oak Leaf Trail, which if you haven't walked it, is just lovely. On the west, the south The southern border is the hospital, Columbia St. Mary, which is called basically North Ave, which I love to say that the south is north. And the northern one is, I think it's Silver Spring, and we'll get into some of the details of it. But the question is, how is this one giant house? Because that's really what it gets down to. And Eruv is basically making a whole neighborhood into a giant shared house or a courtyard, like basically making it all part of your enclosed front yard. But how do you do that? So the easiest way to do that, hold on. Oh, good. The easiest way to do that is to live in Jerusalem. Why? Because Yerushalayim is, or at least the old city, is surrounded by a wall. So the easiest way to have a house is to have 4 walls. And again, you have gates going in and out. But generally, if your whole community is surrounded by a wall, as ancient cities used to be, boom, there's your Eruv. Makes life so much easier. And the reality is, as I'll get to in a moment, there are parts of our Eruv where there's buildings going along it that basically are a wall. There are walls and fences that are in place that are part of our Eruv that we didn't put up. You literally walk around and you see, is there an unbroken chain of natural or man-made structures that completely encloses, whether they're in the shape of a door, which could literally be a string and 2 poles, which we built a lot of those, or our Rabbi Shotkin built them. That or natural man-made things that actually, this is this picture here. You could have fences, you could have buildings, all that stuff that's in place. You don't need to do anything to it. If there exists a physical structure around the neighborhood, you're almost done. There's one thing at the end we'll do, but you don't have to build anything. This top left picture here, this slope with a tree, is really cool. The phrase for it in Hebrew is a tel hamislaket. And what it is if you have a hill or some sort of cliffside or something that is so slanted, and there's a specific degree, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but if it's slanted enough, you can say that you basically treat it like a wall. So on the shore of Lake Michigan, because the lake is flat, that's not a wall, but there are cliffs along Lake Michigan, and they are at enough of a slope that you basically treat it as if it's a straight up wall. So I'll repeat that again. If you have a sloped hill at the border around where you want to enclose it, make it part of your house, you treat it like a wall. Even if it's below, like let's say this is the level of the street and the slope is over here, you pretend as if this is a wall down here, even though it's below the Eruv. So for those who are familiar with the neighborhood in Atwater Park, where you have the structure of the person made out of letters, which my kids call the puzzle man, at the bottom of that park is a big slope going down. It's below street level. That's a wall. That is considered a side of the Eruv. So if you go all the way down to the beach, you've left the Eruv. So if you stay on the sidewalk of Atwater Park, as long as you're at the top of the slope here in the picture, you're good to go. So again, these are all natural things that just make life so much easier. Fences, buildings. Again, if you live in Yerushalayim, you have a wall, stuff that's already in place. But what happens when you start walking along and you're like, well, there's a massive gap of a mile here where there's nothing. We need this to be a border, but there's nothing here. There's no buildings, no fences, no cliffs. What do we do? And the answer is sometimes you have telephone wires. And the great thing about a telephone wire is it's a giant pole with strings going across it. So you got 2 poles, string going across. So there are cities where you have telephone or electric poles going around the whole city. Boom, that's your Eruv. Literally the form of a doorway, the shape of a doorway, as if it were a house. And I'm repeating that because that's the conceptual underpinning. As if it were the walls and doors of a house, if they surround a whole city, are golden. But here's an interesting little thing that people don't think about, and you can see it in this image. If you want this central massive pole here to be, one pole of the door, you need the top of the door to go over it. But what's the issue here? There's no wire going over the top. So what you might need to do is, let's say you have a wire going slightly to the left. What you might need to do, and we've done this all over Milwaukee or all over our Eruv, is you need to actually put an extension, a piece of wood or a plastic pole that goes directly under the wire. So when I check the Eruv in my section for this week, there are a bunch of telephone poles, and some of them, the wire goes right over it. So it's the shape of a doorway. But in some of them, the wire is slightly to the side. And what the rabbi did is he just actually, We Energies, amazingly, put up these plastic protector guards, U-guards, and they go slightly out to the side, and it means the wire goes over it, and you have the shape of your doorway, and it's as if you've extended your house. Beautiful. But even with all of those, there's still gaps where there's absolutely nothing. So how do you close up the gaps? And that is where this wonderful gentleman, Rabbi Micha Shatkin, comes in. And there's a lot of things you can do. Let's say you have a pole. This is a light pole here. So you got one part of the door, and there's a light pole over here, but they didn't put wires. Why would they put wires? So we get permission to do what? Put our own wire, shape of a door. But what if there's literally nothing? There's no poles, no wires, nothing. Then what you need to do is you put up your own poles. And we have to go to, you cannot build an Eruv without permission from those who control the property. So that means if we want to put up a wire or a pole on someone's private property, we need their explicit permission. But if you want to do it in the public space, you need to go to the city and you need to get permission from them. That's really important. You cannot secretly build an Eruv if you want to build something. If, again, the city happens to be surrounded by fences, you don't need to ask permission. You have an Eruv. But if you want to build something on someone's property and consider it a kosher Eruv, you must get permission. So that is basically how you build an Eruv. And every city's a little different. Some cities have more fences. Some cities have more telephone poles. In Los Angeles, I think they use the freeway as part of it. But you can't include the freeway itself in the Eruv. Why? Because the freeway is a totally public domain because you have so many cars. It is such a big open public space. You can never make it private. It needs to be an area that's semi-suburban, semi-rural. So our neighborhood is pretty, even though there's a university, it's still pretty suburban. And, it's enough of a quiet neighborhood that you can make it from semi-public, Carmelite, into private. So before we get into some exceptions where it doesn't matter if you have an Eruv, any questions up until now? That's how you build an Eruv, how we built our Eruv. Yes, Jane, please. I think you're already unmuted.
Can water ever be used? Because I thought that Manhattan was an Eruv in and of itself because it was an island, but I must be mistaken.
So it's not, and I've actually heard that question before, and there's some really great books. There's a Rabbi Chaim Jachter, who wrote a really great book in English on the Eruv, and he talks about the controversies around the Manhattan Eruv. So there's a few issues with Manhattan. One is that there are neighborhoods where it's definitely, most will hold it's private enough that you can make it into, a home. You can build an Eruv there. But places like Times Square can just never be part of it. So you can't make all of Manhattan because there's too many spaces in Manhattan that are just crazy public and big roads, et cetera, like that, bisecting it. And that's an issue, is what if you have a highway going through? You cannot make a highway part of an Eruv. So there are places where you have to work around it, build over it, et cetera, like that. The other one is, I don't know the topography of Manhattan to know if the sides of it, the cliffs, there are parts that I'm sure have the right slope, but I don't know the totality of it. So if it was Manhattan 200 years ago, when it was just a couple of people living there, maybe if the whole island was at a slope, maybe you could make that argument. But in general, with most islands, it usually doesn't work for one reason or another. But the other thing you said about water is that wilderness, total wilderness, cannot be a part of an Eruv. So a pond, a lake, a forest needs to be cordoned off, meaning that not only do you need to make a boundary around your neighborhood, but you need to make a separate boundary separating your Eruv from the wilderness. So if you live in Manhattan, in Washington Heights, Fort Tryon Park is not part of, which is just a massive, gorgeous park right next to this neighborhood, is not part of the Eruv because a huge part of it is forest. And being able to make that part of the Eruv gets complicated. So if there's a giant forest in the middle of your neighborhood, you basically need to cordon it off, like police tape around it, and you cannot walk through it. Now, I'm not talking about maybe small trees and maybe a small woods, but like actual wilderness can never be part of an Eruv. So again,
What about
talking about places
Lake
where you're just
Park?
out of luck. What's that?
What about Lake Park in our neighborhood?
So that's not wilderness, even though there's a lot of trees there and like hiking through, because it's a settled area. It's like nice and kept up and everything like that. Now, an interesting question about those hiking trails. I'd have to look and see if they are in the Eruv. But again, the park is not total wilderness. And that's the key there. In Fort Tryon, there's a huge chunk that's just untouched by man. It just happens to be there in the park. And again, if there was a giant river running through kind of thing. Stream, probably okay. And don't quote me on that, but a river, definitely no. So we don't have to deal with that, thank goodness. But there are some real challenges to Eruvim. Is one of the reasons it took so many years is because we had these massive gaps that we had to put up all these poles, and the city actually happened to do that. There's some fences that didn't exist 20 years ago, light poles that didn't exist 20 years ago that made our lives so much easier. But there are places where, practically speaking, it's nigh impossible to build one. So we're very, very lucky. Any other questions? Because that was the meat of the class there. And I'll take time at the end for more questions too, once we've gotten through it all. Beautiful. Excellent. So this next question here is, somebody lives as for me for 4 years, and all of those who lived here for so many decades, what do you do in a place without an Eruv? If you are someone who is observant of the laws of Shabbat, so you do not carry outside of your home. And and it's really, really a struggle, not just for carrying a key or a book or being able to have a picnic in the park, but one of the biggest struggles is parents of small children and not being able to have a stroller. So, for example, there are families who might find, if there's a non-Jewish babysitter or something like that, and they have an arrangement before Shabbat to push the stroller. Again, the reason I say that is asking a non-Jew on Shabbat to break Shabbat on behalf of the Jew is problematic. But if there's an arrangement beforehand, it's less problematic. But again, it's a challenge. And there are, in New York, in Manhattan, where I live, my community held by the Eruv. So if we needed to push a stroller, I don't think we had a baby at the time, no problem. But for the families who didn't hold by it, because they thought it was too much of a public property, and they had 9 kids, the reality is the women wouldn't go to shul. So we're not just getting here into talking about observance and the technicalities, we're talking about community and someone's experience on Shabbat. And while keeping the biblically God-mandated laws of Shabbat as understood by the rabbis is really important for an observant Jew in connection with God and our religion, building community is also deeply important. Being able to pray, being able to go to synagogue. So having an Eruv is not just about allowing one to be observant, it also allows us to have a sense of family and allow someone to have a full, rich Jewish experience. And again, you can talk to, as the rabbi, I have to be at shul. I want to be at shul, but I have to be at shul. But for Sarah, when the Eruv is not up and if there's not someone to help with the kids, she was stuck at home, and that is tough. And I empathize deeply with her. But it's not just her, it's young mothers all over the world. So in our community, the yeshiva wits, also the people in that community with kids, it really is a big deal to not have an Eruv. So we're really thankful we have it. But if you don't have an Eruv, are there things that you can carry that would be permitted? And the answer is there are some exceptions. So the top left one, I've never read this book, but it's just a cute image, Shabbat puppy. But the question is, what if somebody has a dog? That dog needs to be walked, not just for their health, but they have to go to the potty and they cannot do it in the house. Generally, they don't want to. If they have to, they'll have accidents, but they really want to go outside. So if your dog is perfectly trained, like my father, Alav Hashem, had a dog who you could pretend you were holding a leash and she would walk like she was on a leash, but most dogs aren't like that. You need a leash, not just to lead them, but to prevent them from running into traffic or running off, to keep them safe. But if there's no Eruv, can you carry? And the answer is yes. And the reasons why, partly because it's a matter of safety, but the other reason is this. And this is a really interesting conceptual thing for the rabbis, and they love their conceptual things. If I'm holding the leash, leading my dog, you could say I'm holding the leash, but you could also say, who's holding not the leash, the leash, who's holding it? Tamar? Or you just have to unmute yourself? I think you're saying the dog, right?
The dog.
Yeah, the dog. Even though my hand is on it, I'm not the one carrying it. The dog is, I'm not leading the animal is leading me. So we're not going to go into all the ins and outs of it. That's a conceptual thing there. But again, because there's a need, it's for the safety of the animal. And in certain cases, and this goes all the way back to the Talmud, before dogs as pets, this goes to leading donkeys, et cetera, like that. But for their safety, so they don't get hurt, they don't hurt others, and the understanding that they're doing the carrying, then it would be permitted. And a dog owner just vouched for that when you're walking a dog, it's usually them they're doing the work. Whether it's avodah or melacha, the dog does the work. These other two images are very much connected, whether these two people who are using canes to walk or this person in a wheelchair. I went back and I said, one cannot carry things, if there's no Eruv, that are not an immediate part of their body, as their clothes, their jewelry. So how do we define immediate part of one's body? Is we describe it both as essentially as things that are either, essential to your ability to move around. So I'm not going to go around in the nude. That's not done. I need to wear clothes. Therefore, they're an extension of my body. Again, I'll repeat that. Clothing, because it's a necessary thing, whether because of humility, appropriateness, or the protecting from the environment, are an extension of my body. Jewelry, which is a decoration, is decorating my body, an extension of my body. If a person cannot walk without a wheelchair, a walker, or some other device, that is considered an extension of their body. They are not carrying something, it is a part of their person. Again, that's a really beautiful, powerful, and important concept, is if somebody cannot move without some sort of object, it is considered an extension of their body, a part of their person. Now, this bottom image poses some other problems because electricity or activating and manipulating electric objects on Shabbat is not permitted. So what does one do if their way to get around is an electric wheelchair? So I think this image is actually from an organization in Israel called Somet that created or has worked on creating a wheelchair that uses electricity, but in a way which is not explicitly against the laws of Shabbat. But strictly speaking, it would be better for someone who cannot walk, or it is nearly impossible for them to walk to shul, to use a manual wheelchair, or to buy one of these special Shabbat wheelchairs from this organization, Somet, or one built in that way. So any questions on these exceptions? And there's some minor ones that I may have either just forgotten, et cetera, and some complicated things about carrying children that we're not going to go into, but these are the big conceptual ones about, again, an extension of your person. One doesn't need an Eruv. So if we have a week where the Eruv's down, I'm not carrying my key or my talit, but if somebody wants to come to shul and they need their walker, that's fine, whether the Eruv is up or down. Any questions? Yeah, Alina. Just got to unmute you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Is this the same logic that allows glasses?
You mean wearing glasses?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. They are considered, and it's not just because one needs them to see. It's, I mean, I guess it is because one needs them to see. But even decorative sunglasses. First of all, they're certainly functional, but yes, they would be considered an extension of one's person. A hat. But here's a really interesting thing, and the rabbis do debate this in the Talmud, is a sword. And the reason that was interesting, that was relevant, is that back in the day, and in some countries today still, a sword was carried as a decorative object. Again, the same way that, I actually have a necklace. So the same way that a necklace or jewelry or watch might be considered a decorative extension of one's body because it decorates your body, in ancient times, and in some cultures still, a sword did the same. But the rabbis didn't permit a sword. And the reason for that, does anyone know why, even though it was a decorative object, an extension of one's body, why the rabbi said no to swords? Any guesses? Ken, I think you're unmuted if you want to take a guess, please.
Yeah, because it's a destructive instrument.
It's a sword. A sword, it would be incongruous. One of my rabbis love to use that word, incongruous, to be carrying a sword, which is an object of war and destruction on the holy Sabbath. So while technically, it should be the same thing that would permit glasses or earrings, et cetera, like that, it's a sword. Don't carry a sword on Shabbat. So again, even with all the conceptual logical rules, there are exceptions that go both ways. Exceptions that permit and exceptions that forbid. So, the last thing that yeah, Ken, please, then we'll do the last step.
Two questions. One in them with if the gentleman was in a mechanical wheelchair, is someone else permitted to push them?
Yes. You mean like a non-Jewish person or
a Jewish person?
So if it's in an Eruv, no issue whatsoever. Are you talking about one that's not electric based?
Yeah, not electric. But suppose that there's no Eruv, but you said, using a cane if you need it, or using a wheelchair if you need it?
No, so that would be a problem. If there is no Eruv, a person who can only get around in a wheelchair can push themselves, but a Jew could not push them. They would need a non-Jewish helper or friend or something like that, and it would need to be preset before Shabbat. So that is challenging for someone who cannot get to synagogue other than in a wheelchair, and there's no Eruv. And again, people think about the Eruv as a luxury. It's so nice. I can, again, we can do a picnic, or I can carry my kids, or we can go to the park and bring a Frisbee and everything like that. But this is having an Eruv is a major fundamental quality of life thing, not just for families with young children, but also for people with physical disabilities. So no, if there's no Eruv, a fellow Jew could not, unless of course it's an emergency, it would need to be a non-Jew. But if there's an Eruv, anyone can push. Because a lot of people in wheelchairs are not always able to move the wheels and push themselves. And I've actually talked to people in this community who said, Rabbi, when you get the Eruv up, tell me, and I might be able to have someone push me in a wheelchair, and I'd love to come to shul, kind of thing. So that's the answer to that. And you said you had a second question?
Sure. If we go back to that sloping wall, like at Atwater Park, if that's the wall that, theoretically carries up, if you're walking down that, that path, you're sort of on the opposite side of the wall.
Correct.
So you have to empty your pockets on a street level.
Correct. So if I go to the top of Atwater Park, like the playground there, before it slopes down, I believe that would be considered part of the Eruv, certainly the sidewalk, that is part of the Eruv. But if I wanted to walk down to the beach, which I can walk to the beach on Shabbat, but I can't carry anything, because as soon as that slope starts, I have left the Eruv. So one of the things about this class, and I'll mention one at the end because someone asked me, is some people don't, there are certain things about the Eruv that, not everyone fully understands. So I'll mention that at the end before we open it up for questions. But yes, the slope would be considered, it's almost like at the top of the slope is an invisible wall that, is the boundary of the Eruv. So that's an important distinction there, that again, if people say, I don't see, if you see the shape of the Eruv, if I see the telephone wires, I know, don't cross that. If I see a fence, don't cross that. That's easy. But when it gets to slopes, conceptually, it may not be as clear, but that's the answer. Don't cross the slope. At the top of the slope, it's like there's an invisible wall. Don't start going down the slope if you have something in your pockets or carrying something, etc. Excellent. So before I get on to a few other nuances, one question that comes up a lot is keys. Is not everybody has a push button key or has a lockbox at their house, which is what a lot of Jews do. They want to be able to, for safety, security reasons, carry their key. So again, in an Eruv, you don't have to worry about this, but this is one of those exceptions is there a way to carry my key? Now, what a lot of Jews do is they think, oh, I'll take the key and I'll wear it as a necklace. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't work. And the reason that doesn't work is keys are not worn as necklaces. They are not typical jewelry. So if it was the common custom for people to make necklaces out of keys, you'd have no problem. But putting a key on a necklace or a keychain or something like that, like a lanyard, doesn't cut it, because that is not the typical kind of jewelry that people wear. People wear their keys like that, but that's because they're carrying their key. It's not jewelry. It's not an extension of the person. Therefore, it's considered carrying. So if you want to attach your key to your body, you need to do it in a functional way. So this is a product that you don't have to buy. You could make it yourself, called a Shabbos belt. And it's a belt with two little clips, and you clip it on either side of your key. And if your key doesn't have holes, you need to punch it into it. And people will wear this in place of a belt, meaning that it actually serves a function to hold up your pants. So again, this doesn't work for everybody. If people wear skirts or dresses, etc., it doesn't make sense. But this is one of the few ways in which people could actually use their carry their key in a permitted way. So when someone puts their key around a lanyard or wears it on a bracelet, it doesn't actually work. And a lot of people misunderstand the laws of carrying and jewelry, etc., like that. So the last thing I want to do is, before I get to the next section, is just mention one thing that I don't want anyone to take for granted. When there is an Eruv, when it says it's permitted to carry things in it, one can only carry things that you are allowed to use on Shabbat. So great, we have an Eruv. So can I carry a flamethrower? Can I carry a video game or my phone? And again, I'm talking about those who choose to be Shabbat observant. Everyone chooses how they want to observe Shabbat. So this is not to say you may not carry your phones, but if someone wishes to be Shabbat observant, just because there's an Eruv, I can't carry my phone. Why? Because I'm not allowed to use it on Shabbat in the first place. So someone had asked me, what about an umbrella? So an umbrella, what would be the issue with that? And the issue with that is that one is not permitted to use an umbrella on Shabbat. Why? Because it's considered like making a tent. And one of the 39 categories of forbidden activities, melacha and Shabbat, is building a tent, a protective tent. And what is an umbrella other than a protective tent meant to protect one from the rain? So opening up an umbrella on Shabbat is not a permitted activity. Using it as a tent, the moment you've lifted an umbrella off the ground and held it up, you've created a tent over yourself. So if there's a canopy, if there's a canopy over a building and I run under it for protection, I didn't set that tent up. It was already there. But setting up an umbrella, lifting it, opening it, etc., would not be permitted. So it doesn't matter if one has an Eruv, and would not permit using umbrellas because they're never permitted on Shabbat, Eruv or not. So the very last thing that I'll open up for questions is, you built your Eruv, you put up your poles, you cemented them in the ground, you have your 5 million tensile strength fishing wire everywhere, you have the shapes of doors and walls completely surrounding, no gaps whatsoever, made up of slopes, buildings, fences. Great. Can you start carrying? And the answer is no. Why? Because at the end of the day, this is all about creating, it is about the technical laws of Shabbat, but it's also about building community by making the public space private, by making it one shared home. And what defines a home more than anything for Jewish people is eating, is having meals. So one of the most important things that you do, and there's a blessing for it, is to set up what is called an Eruv Chatzerot, literally a mixing together of courtyards. And what you do is you take some food, you put it in a central place where everyone can have access to it. And what that does is it makes all of everyone's property, everyone basically shares together, meaning that for the purposes of Shabbat observance, my home, Ken's home, Tamar's home, Lake Park Synagogue, Lake Park, all of those places, we are all saying it's one big home. I am sharing this space with you, you share the space with me, and we have marked that in a beautiful symbolic way by having this box of matzah. I believe it's actually at the yeshiva, and the reason, it doesn't have to be matzah. We could do a new one every week on any kind of substantial food. It could be chalot, it could be kugels, etc. Why does anyone want to venture a guess why we do it on a box of matzah?
It lasts a long time.
It lasts for 10,000 years. It's like Twinkies. It never goes bad. I think that's not true. But you in Eruv Chatzerot, this symbolic food, this blessing on this food lasts as long as the food is edible. So if you don't have matzah, if you're doing it on a kugel, you're going to have to do a new one every single week. But if you do it on matzah, it'll last for 10, 15,000 years, something like that. But again, it's not only an essential act, it's not just about the physical structure, but it's about saying, my home is your home, and you accepting that your home is my home, and we have one big shared space. And again, you can't do that with a freeway or Times Square. You can't say that's part of my home. It's too public. But here on the east side of Milwaukee, everyone has a sense of neighborliness, of being shared. And even for anyone on this call who says, well, I'm not quite in the Eruv, we can always extend it. But again, at the end of the day, an Eruv is there to build a sense of community. Whether you're technically in the Eruv or not, it says about a Jewish community, we are a community. We want everyone to be able to be physically present, to feel like they're part of something greater.